Just before I begin, I do want a little correction there. That me at the Spatial Information Design Lab is a couple of years back. So currently I'm an architect and I am an urban justice advocate. I have a nonprofit called the Urban Justice League where we work with data, ethics, and urban justice. And we have these fabulous panelists here that I'm just going to read out a very brief intro, just in case you didn't look them up before or you're not familiar with their work, and we'll jump right into discussion. So Molly Krabappel is an American artist and writer. She is a contributing editor for Vice and has reported with words and art from Ukraine, Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, refugee camps, and borders. Noah Chasson, fellow Colombian, is an adjunct associate professor of architecture in the urban design program at Columbia GSAPP. His teaching, research, and writing centers on issues of human rights in zones of urban conflict. So with these two amazing people and trying to make this a very fluid discussion, I'm going to jump right into the question of what is the ideal citizen city? And if we think about it, it's 3 words, but it's a super loaded question because not only am I going to ask both of you to define what the ideal citizen is, I'm also going to ask you to define what the city is that the ideal citizen needs. So without putting in other words, I think the floor is all yours,
Thank you. First, I have to make a slight correction. I am no longer a contributing editor at Vice because Vice is bankrupt. It's been some years. However, before I answer this rather complex question, I just want to acknowledge that we cannot talk about cities, ideal or otherwise, without acknowledging that the city of Gaza is currently being subjected to a genocidal bombing campaign by Israel. One that not only has murdered over 30,000 people, but also is obliterating the urban fabric of mosques and universities and libraries and art galleries and everything that we value in a city. I also want to acknowledge that when I think of the ideal city, I think about citizens and non-citizens being able to use the streets and plazas of that city. And I want to give my profound respect to the student protesters at Columbia University. And also the other university encampments, especially the working class students of CUNY Uptown. So with that, an ideal citizen, no such thing. An ideal city, also no such thing, but maybe I'll talk about my ideal city, right? Because the ideal is always a loaded and subjective term. I am from New York. It is my muse. I love this messed up, rat-infested place that can't figure out how to make a dumpster, where the Canal Street subway station literally becomes a canal of rain because it has so many leaks. I love a city that has people from every corner of the world speaking languages that have long since gone extinct in their places of origin. A city where anyone can become a New Yorker, and you don't have to learn English. My abuela never did. You don't have to change how you dress. You don't have to change your religion. You just have to yoke yourself to the brutal hustle of this place. Anyone can become a New Yorker, except Becky from Connecticut. It's true, it's true. So when I think of the ideal city for me, I think of those things, of the intense hyper-diversity, the crammed togetherness, the taking of spaces wherever you can, and the sense of belongingness that is not like a kind, all-embracing thing, but is rather something intensely hard won.
Great. Yeah. What about you, Noah? What do you think?
Is this on? Yeah? Okay. I love that you ended with that phrase, sense of belonging, because it's one that I use all the time in my teaching and in my writing, which is either a sense of belonging or a sense of placedness. And I do think, echoing pretty much everything that Molly said, that New York is a place in which this idea of placedness is on full display and is accessible in a way that is not in a lot of other places. But the way that I describe it typically when a student asks, or somebody else, is the notion that when you've arrived in a place, you feel that you belong there. And I don't know that there's a way in which one can, well, in fact, I do know that there is no way in which you can design a city to have those qualities. They are something that come about organically through issues of governmentality, through issues of cultural exchange, through the palimpsestic nature of cities, which is these historical layers that accrue over time and that never, hopefully, really ever disappear. And so in terms of the ideal citizen, also fully agreed to even propose such a thing, and this is not a critique of the title of the you know, I think it's a great provocation, but I would be really cautious about any kind of facile definition of what constitutes an ideal citizen or an ideal city. However, the conditions that would bring about an ideal city and ideal citizens is that sense of belonging, is a sense of equal participation, a sense of agency, and public spaces in particular that instantiate the possibility of that kind of participation. If you don't have public spaces that are equally accessible, that are properly public and not sequestered from certain, I don't know who Becky is, by the way, but I'm all for keeping her out, I guess.
We can sequester public spaces from her.
Okay, good. But just an equitable access to public spaces, that, you know, and the ability to exercise citizenship, or what somebody like Henri Lefebvre referred to as the right to the city. That is a deeply complicated topic, but it's also one that absolutely needs to exist in advance of any other kind of idealization of the city, I think.
Great, yeah. Like we just heard, so there's no ideal city. And on that note, also this idea that New York City is not also in any way ideal for a lot of movements, but has been the home to plenty of movements around the world that have. So what gives this city that kind of roots to, you know, instead of like the city being a container for a certain population, it is more like acting as a conduit for allowing for movements to actually, like moments and movements to turn into bigger revolutions. And this is something that the city has been doing in the past. We have witnessed the Black Lives Matters. We have witnessed something that you were very much active in, the Occupy Wall Street movement. So I guess the question in some ways is, like, how does the city become that canvas for art, which is in some ways your medium of, you know, provocation, or, you know, in other ways, in writing, like how does the city become a canvas for allowing these social movements to turn into larger enacting social and political change?
I'm going to start with something that you're not supposed to do, which is naming an enemy. I think that the greatest threat to New York City, and not just New York City, obviously, but cities around the world, is the power of real estate capital and the financialization of real estate. The idea that an apartment is not a place that you live in, raise your family in, but rather is an asset that BlackRock can buy and then gamble on and slice up shares of. The idea that the purpose of a city isn't its people, but just a sort of conduit and container for capital. When I think of the single biggest thing that makes a city good for art, it's called cheap rent.
Yet, most of the artists are in the most expensive cities in the world, so.
Exactly. And when I think about specific New York things that enable people to live, it's the policy of rent stabilization, which is the policy that allows working class people to stay in their apartments and not get booted out every 2 years, something which is very bad for artists and our big studios. And when I think about what we need to do to make cities better for art or for movements, it's the same thing that we need to do to make cities just better for humans, which is to fight against the power of the real estate industry and to have a strong tenants movement.
Great.
Yeah, once again, I couldn't agree more. I think the financialization of real estate in this advanced state of capitalism, especially in New York, but really it's a global phenomenon, is the thing that's most detrimental to maintaining the kind of cultural, religious, political richness that a city like New York really exemplifies. And without access to a stable home, effectively everything else falls away. That probably some of you have read this really compelling book called Evicted that really lays out precisely how the lack of a stable home, of a place that you know that you can go to at the end of the day and lay your head down after a day's work. Without that, you can't open up a bank account. You can't get a job. You can't, participate as properly, as far as I would consider it, as a citizen, without that sense of groundedness that that a home. Whether you want to look at that in a quantitative measure in terms of an address to it and a landlord to whom you pay money, or if you want to think about it in a more holistic way as some sort of habitat. But this whole logic of rentier capitalism, whereby what we see in New York today are tall apartment buildings with 30% occupancy, and the rest of them are all owned by either large multinational corporations or very wealthy people. And what that's doing is providing or creating the illusion of a real estate crisis, a lack of adequate housing, when in fact that's not really the case. It's simply that landlords are unwilling to rent at below market value, and so they just land bank these spaces, which effectively creates a kind of ghost city within the vibrant city that we live in and that we love. And it's really it's despicable, honestly, that this is allowed to occur. And to think about how many people, whether they're artists or other deeply creative, thoughtful people who are being denied the opportunity to be citizens of this city because there's no place for them to live, whether it's because they have been priced out of it or whether it's because there's this illusion of scarcity is really shameful. And breaks down any possibility that we can of moving towards something ideal.
And often I feel like projects that aim to sort of like top-down design, like ideal arts districts, ideal cities, are actually just sort of marketing vehicles for real estate capital. Like I look at Hudson Yards, right, which literally stole money that was meant for low-income housing in Harlem to build their mall and suicide platform there.
$200 million art piece to commit a suicide from, sure. But I'm going to push back a little bit on that. And it brings, while we're on this topic of art slightly, and the city itself, I think artists are taking the burden of these social movements, which are, historically have been so vital to our communities, are yet the most underpaid part of any society. And this is not just, not just New York or the United States, but all around the world. And I guess, I do push back on this ideas of just, the financial part of being able to stay here. There is more to New York City. I mean, we can talk about other examples. I am going to throw another very abrupt example here, just to, kind of open up this even further. But I come from a very close city, originally Karachi, but I'm not going to talk about it in that context. I was born in Abu Dhabi. And one of the most eye-opening moments for me was last December when I was down at COP as part of Colombia's delegation. And instead of a speaking engagement, I joined a protest. And if you guys heard about COP, COP had this blue zone and the green zone, and it was being held in an area that was hosting the World Expo a couple of years back. So that Disneyland of architecture, or however you guys want to see it, was transformed into something that became the area to talk about climate justice, climate, oil companies, all kinds of issues. And think about this, COP being held at one of historically most biggest oil producers. The blue zone was basically controlled by the UN. The green zone was controlled by the UAE government, which by law does not allow dissent. So my entire life, I've never been part of any protest in that region. So for me, this was a big thing, to be part of a protest about climate justice, about Gaza, that I could not have done anywhere else in the UAE context. And this brings to another very important point, which is the allowance, the idea, the right to protest in a city, which today is so challenged across college campuses, maybe down even in Washington Square Park. We've seen this over the last couple of months, where the one single thing that held so close to heart of every American, which was to be able to protest, has been questioned. And I guess it totally threw away everything that I learned in the academic environment about what the US Constitution stands for. But what is now, how does that shape this ideal city now?
I think this is a really important point that you're making. I mean, one of the things that I think makes New York so precious to me is the ownership that its people can take over it. And this ownership could be the people who tore up the concrete of abandoned lots and made community gardens where they grew food for their communities. It could be how in the 1980s people took over buildings from landlords that literally wanted to burn them down for insurance money, and they made it into homes for themselves, even if they had to squat for 10 years. But in terms of protest, you're right. New York is both a city that is home to, constant protests about everything. And I am currently a Cullman Fellow at the New York Public Library, so pretty much every day I'm hearing beautiful Palestine protests out my window, something I appreciate a lot. But it's also a place that intensively polices protest. The scenes from Colombia were really shocking because there's generally been an agreement not to call cops onto campuses. But police have, for my entire life, been extremely violent to protests. When I was, I guess I was in my late 20s, I remember it was the 1-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, and I literally had a cop grab me by the arm, drag me into the middle of the street, and then arrest me for blocking traffic. I think he just wanted someone who was short, who seemed like they wouldn't give him trouble to make an arrest quota. But this has always been a tension of New York, right? We protest constantly, we seize public space constantly, but also we have, incredibly violent police force that smashes our skulls all the time when we do it.
Do you have a say?
I should start with the caveat that I'm in no way speaking on behalf of Columbia University being here, although I am on the faculty. But what we are seeing that, really kind of catalyzed on the Columbia campus, and I remember it was a week and a half ago, coming out of class and seeing the first assembly of the encampment. And even at that time, it seemed exceedingly genteel, I would say. Fervent, for sure, and vital and committed, but not in any way violent or aggressive or disruptive. So when I heard the next day, less than 24 hours later, that the police were called in, I was really, as were many of the faculty members, taken aback. It's also important to note that the Columbia University campus is a private space, technically, although really, to be super technical about it, the conduit between Broadway and Amsterdam, 116th Street, is actually public. But it's, we have a lot of weird hybrid spaces in New York. Occupy Wall Street occupied one of them, which is the exceedingly confusingly named privately owned public space. That's a real thing. Even has an acronym, POPs, right? And they're basically spaces that have been given over to real estate developers as a means of giving them an easement for Gesundheit, in order to build taller, wider, broader, and in exchange, they give over a portion of the footprint of their property to what's allegedly a public space. It's a very unusual arrangement. I don't know that it exists elsewhere. But anyway, I'm digressing. So going back to Columbia, that conduit is not actually a privately owned public space. It's a public space that happens to be squeezed between two deeply private spaces. But this, we're getting into this notion of protest and free speech is absolutely essential if we were going to try to move towards this idea of the ideal. The moment that one is incapable of speaking one's mind, of exercising the universal human right to assembly and association, we're headed down a path of no return, right? That it has to be protected, and there's. At Columbia, as I'm sure many of you know, there's a long history of protest, just as there is around the city, but even a set of provisions to anticipate what we should do during a protest that were put in place after the 1968 student uprisings. And there has been a kind of flagrant disregard for those at the peril of really starting to tear at the fabric of the university. And for those of you who've been to the university know that although it's in an area of Manhattan that is not really visited by anybody other than if you're going to Columbia, it's still very much a vital part of a community. And the fallout from what has been happening, we see that, I think a lot of the protests that we see around the country are reflections of the rage against the injustice of not being able to speak.
I want to second everything you said, Noah. I don't even know how to describe it because it's both so violent but also so ludicrous and stupid. This crackdown on young people who are against genocide, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about universities sending in jackbooted cops, in some cases like in Emory, to beat up students and professors because young people are against a genocide. That's it. That's what's going on. It's shocking to me. One of my friends is Sinan Antun. He is a great Iraqi novelist and poet. He was arrested at NYU for literally linking arms with his colleagues to defend his students from getting their heads cracked in when NYU called in the police on their encampment. NYU then literally built a wall. They built a wall to board up their campus because they were so worried about young people being against genocide. This is one of the most, like, just repellent, sniveling, cowardly responses I've ever seen by a chain of people in power, and I'm just continuously shocked by it every day.
I think it's, in the context of the city being, the campus being a microcosm of a city, and then if we look at what's happening at the college campuses. So it takes me back to this conversation that we had with a philosopher and also Columbia faculty, Akil Bilgrami, who was talking about the design of a new university, which is actually Columbia's new campus, and the idea of a square. And then we talk about, and his question was, and we had other people in that room, and that included the ex-provost, who I would like to bring up now because he was the supporter of Edward Said when the entire US government wanted him out. And that same university today called the rights police. So in that discussion, he asked, he looks at all these designs and he says, where is the Tahrir Square in this campus? And I think today we have, the lawn is now with the encampments, the Tahrir Square. But, it doesn't stop there, right? Because it is the movement, and all of us somewhere are hoping that these movements grow, and kind of like it's not just about students who are against Israel's genocide in Gaza, but it's also about the change that they want to see in this country, right? We want to stop certain things from happening. And I think then maybe deviating this question slightly is if the Tahrir Square equivalent is what's important for a city. In case of Occupy, we had the Zuccotti Park. And a lot of the pop spaces, like the public, privately owned public spaces, have been the squares for dissent. What, in your opinion, have been successful squares or even monuments of movements that have given a city a space for dissent, a space for mobilization, a space for allowing citizens to enact political change?
City government doesn't usually want there to be a really successful protest movement. So generally, the spaces that these things kick off aren't things that could have been foreseen in advance. I don't think anyone would have thought that a mafia-owned gay bar would have been the place that kicked off the revolution for gay rights, but that's what Stonewall was. It was just like a mafia-owned dive bar where people got sick of being harassed by cops. I live near Zuccotti Park. No one would ever compare Zuccotti Park to some grand square. It is not like Maidan in Kiev. It is not like Tahrir. It is a little corporate park where people eat their lunch. That momentarily was transformed into a prefiguration of the future. I think that I don't know if these things are places that can be planned, and I also don't know about the success of the leaderless uprisings of the squares either. When I look at Occupy from over a decade back, I see some of the failings that also came from our leaderlessness. I think that what New York has that perhaps makes it better for protest is, unlike any other city in all of America, we did not gut our density and our public transit infrastructure in order to serve the god of the automobile. I think the fact that we are the only city in America where you can walk everywhere is probably the thing in our architecture that most sets us up for protest.
Super.
Not that that's prevented a surfeit of automobiles from flooding into the city. Something that you mentioned that got me thinking about, whether there's the possibility of, a place for protest, a place that is dedicated for protest. I mean, of course, places like Tiananmen Square, for example, in Beijing, there were prior to the uprising in the late 80s, a number of protests. It was a public space where people went to speak their dissent against whatever injustices they were feeling. And of course, with the student uprising, at that time, it suddenly was shut down. But what is really fascinating, I think, about urban spaces is that, not to be cliche about it, but if there's a will, there's a way. And the fluidity and organicity of protest movements is really inventive and clever and intuitive in terms of being able to, in some senses, turn the city against itself. And that often comes from from that sense of placedness or that sense of belonging, but that sense of belonging also gives you a really intimate knowledge of the city and its spaces and how those spaces can be converted into a bulwark against a police invasion, or converted into a site for gathering or for a public display of dissent. And so less so than, I think it's fairly safe to say that I can't envision a city anytime in the future that will specifically designate a space for protest. Unless it's heavily policed. I'm thinking of like some of the college campuses in this country that were designed after the student uprisings around the Vietnam War, and they were designed in such a way as to have public spaces in those campuses that were completely hemmed in on every side by buildings, such that it was impossible to have a protest there that didn't also have you completely captured by any form of surveillance or of military control. So in the absence of an ideal place to protest, the ways in which the city, as I said before, can be used against itself, can be reconfigured, can be rethought, and it may be incremental spaces, it may be disjointed spaces that somehow come together in a kind of energized matrix, but it can happen, and I think we see it happening. And of course, social media has facilitated that to an even greater degree, whereby one can, find allies who aren't even necessarily present, but who are helping to mobilize, helping to organize, helping to, to facilitate what I think is a fundamental and essential right to protest.
Right. I think with that, I'm going to allow you guys to talk a little bit more about another city in the context of the LLF, which is Lahore, which both of you guys have been in different contexts. And, maybe not in terms of the ideal city, but I think just in terms of there's a density issue there, there's a population issue there. There is that idea, which I think you very accurately said, the ability to walk from one place to another. And we've seen this movement of people joining in and moving towards, but also to tie back to the history of the very early 1953 student protest in Pakistan that changed a lot of the urban politics at that time. I think, what's that takeaway that you guys have from Lahore?
I want to preface this by saying I am by no means an expert, so this is just, please consider this the views of a tourist who visited in 2017. First of all, I always wanted to see Lahore my whole life because I love Mughal architecture, and I just think it's the most beautiful thing in the world, and it was a dream for me to go.
That deserves a clap.
No, it's true. It's like one of the best architectural
for Mughal
styles in the world.
architecture.
What am I supposed to say, But so one of the things that, one of the things that struck me about Lahore, which I guess is me being a little more critical, is there was the most extreme class stratification that I'd ever seen. It was like you had very, very, very rich people that are living almost like, behind walls with armed guards, and then you had very, very poor people, right, who are living in super, super, super density. And that sort of class stratification, even coming from New York, which is so class stratified, as we all know, was something that was new to me. The other thing that my other sort of takeaway was how much the necessities for security had in many ways mutilated this exquisitely beautiful city, like the necessities to put like blast walls around things to keep out, suicide bombers, right? So you would see these like streetscapes that would be like so, like these exquisite buildings, and then they would just kind of be walled off. So it was something in some ways that was very tragic for me, but also, I stayed a few extra weeks because I just love it so much. And for me, places like just walking around like Anarkali Bazaar, even though lots of kids thought I was like a weird Gora lady and wanted to like take photos with me and stuff. Those streets are so cool. They're so vibrant. They're so alive, right? And there was so much to admire in the traditional architectures, in I went to Dada Darbar also, which was amazing, and then like all of like the little stalls behind it, like serving people's religious needs as they went in. And I don't know, I love old cities. I love cities that are like the accumulated wisdom of people living there, and the accumulated fuck-ups too, but also the accumulated wisdom and beauty and culture, the palimpsest. And it was my great honor to visit Lahore.
Very nice.
And especially coming from a city where a really, really old building is like from 1835.
And is about to be knocked down by a real estate developer.
And is probably maybe has like 3 rafters still left over from its original. I even less so, I think, than Molly, am an expert on Lahore. I haven't been there for just under 20 years, but so I suspect that anything that I might say about it, although it is a very old city, I wouldn't stand behind it because I don't know what it looks like, and I'm dying to go back. I was actually there under the auspices of, I was invited to teach a seminar on postmodern urbanism, and for both students at the College of Architecture and also architects. And there were a number of architects that took this seminar. And it was really fascinating to teach the very highly Western concepts of postmodernism, which is supposed to be this language of pastiche and this language of borrowing, and to try to communicate that, realizing that all of the touchstones that we would use in the West for discussing postmodern architecture, and at that point already it was something that was more or less long gone. The experience of teaching it in Lahore was incredibly fascinating to me because I had to rethink the whole way that I understood it in order to explain it to a city that, frankly, is in many ways a postmodern city in its pastiche, in its kind of palimpsestic nature. But it was, and I also regret the fact that I had a manuscript that I started shortly after that has been sitting, waiting for me to resume it because I was planning to go back to do more research. But I'm just going to spoil and tell you what the title was / is, which so there's one of the most famous books about postmodernism is a book by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown called Learning from Las Vegas. So mine was Learning from Lahore. And in the same way that the language of Las Vegas as a place that, would never have been considered a real place by any properly, appreciating architect, in fact, revealed a tremendous amount about the way in which signification, how we look at different buildings, how we look at levels and layers of architecture and learn to read them as if we were reading a book. That for me, Lahore became a city very much more so, I think, than New York, that resisted an easy reading and that just kind of entranced me, and I too look forward to going back as soon as possible. Maybe even next year.
All right. I think just on that notion of Lahore, and I think tying in a little bit with the earlier panel, there's massive concretization happening in Lahore, and the green spaces have been evaporating. When you guys go back, you will see that, and I think this is one of the many bad features happening across our South Asian cities. But just picking on the last note, what you said about some of the oldest inhabited cities. Some of the oldest inhabited cities, Aleppo, Baghdad, Sana'a, Gaza, are being turned into rubble as and when, the politics of space decide. And I think maybe this is like what the ideal citizen is also to realize that an ideal citizen may be a person who realizes that every space has its value, and that these cities that are being rebelized at the fastest rate in modern history, what can we do to stop these?